At just before 2 in the afternoon on the 2nd of August 1947, flight CS-59 left Buenos Aires Morón airfield bound for Santiago, the capital of Chile. Later that day, air traffic control at Santiago Airport received a Morse code transmission from flight CS-59, stating she was approaching the airport and would be landing in around 5 minutes. However, the message ended with a bizarre unrecognised word: STENDEC. Air traffic control requested clarification of the final word and received the same reply: STENDEC, STENDEC. It was the last communication anyone would ever hear from flight CS-59. She never arrived, and for over 50 years her fate remained one of aviation's most perplexing mysteries. BSAA, short for British South American Airways, ran a fleet of aircraft during the mid to late 1940s, providing routes from Britain to South America and the Caribbean. They mostly flew aircraft built by the Avro Company, including a model known as the Lancastrian, which was basically a version of the wartime Lancaster bomber, modified for passenger use. Flight CS-59 used a Lancastrian which had been named Stardust, registration number G-AGWH. Although looking pretty much like a wartime bomber on the outside, the interiors were fitted out for the comfort of travellers. Their capacity was limited to only 13 people, but the aircraft were extremely well suited to the Buenos Aires-Santiago route due to their ability to fly well above 20,000 feet at speeds of over 310 miles per hour, attributes which came in handy when having to fly over the Andes, the mountain range which runs the length of the South American continent. The 5 crew members of flight CS-59 were all veterans of World War II, with extensive flying experience. The captain, Reginald Cook, had been awarded both the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross for his wartime combat flying. This was a guy who knew how to fly a plane and navigate in difficult conditions, the kind of chap you'd want at the controls when you were flying over the Andes in the middle of winter. The 6 passengers booked on the flight were an eclectic group, at first glance seemingly resembling characters straight out of a 1930s whodunit novel. Amongst them, a Palestinian businessman rumoured to have a large diamond sewn into his jacket, a German widow with her husband's ashes as carry-on luggage, the ex-tutor of the Romanian royal family, and a British government official, a king's messenger, carrying a sealed diplomatic bag containing classified documents. At 1:45 p.m. on the 2nd of August 1947, the Stardust took off from Buenos Aires Morón airfield, her destination Santiago, the Chilean capital, some 700 miles to the west, on the other side of the Andes Mountains. During the flight, radio operator Dennis Harmon sent regular Morse code transmissions giving their estimated position and altitude. The final transmission was received by air traffic control in Santiago at around 5:40 local time. It said, ETA Santiago, 17:45 hours, STENDEC. The last word made no sense to the airport radio operator, so he asked for a repeat transmission. The same word came back, twice. STENDEC. STENDEC. There was no further communication from the plane. Attempts to reach her were met with radio silence. Assuming that the Stardust would be in view imminently, the air traffic controllers at Santiago waited for her to touch down, but she never arrived. When it became clear something was amiss, search planes were sent out, initially covering the local area around Santiago, but rapidly spreading out to comb the nearby mountain slopes. An amateur radio enthusiast reported hearing a faint SOS coming from the direction of the mountains, and so the search continued. For 5 days, Chilean, Argentinian and BSAA crews scoured the flight path of flight CS-59 and the surrounding mountains. They found nothing. No plane, no wreckage, no bodies, nothing. It seemed as though the Stardust had simply vanished into thin air. For the next 50 years there was simply no clue as to what happened to flight CS-59. As they say, nature abhors a vacuum, and so in the absence of any evidence, all kinds of wild theories had sprung up regarding the disappearance of the Stardust. Theories which ranged from there being a bomb on board, to a cargo full of stolen gold, or possible diplomatic sabotage. Then, the mysterious final message, STENDEC. It had many theorising about possible alien abduction. However, in 1998, some 51 years after the disappearance of flight CS-59, two Argentinian climbers attempting to summit Mount Tupungato, a huge 6,800-metre peak some 50 miles east of Santiago, came across an out-of-place object high up on the southern face of the mountain. There, in the middle of a glacial field, they found what appeared to be a large, fairly intact Rolls-Royce engine poking out of the ice. Nearby were the tattered remains of what looked to be a pinstripe suit, an old-fashioned lady's shoe, and scraps of metal. Upon reporting this, authorities quickly deduced the significance of the find and set out to visit the site themselves, but they were beaten back by harsh weather conditions. In early 2000, two men did manage to return to the site, Sergeant Cardozo of the Argentine Army and climber Alejo Moiso. They confirmed that the wreckage found did indeed match expected debris of the Stardust, and it looked like that after 50 years, she'd finally been found. Shortly thereafter, a huge expedition involving the Argentinian Army, Air Force, and a full BBC television crew set out for the site, their intent to find clues as to why the plane crashed, why she remained hidden for so long, and to finally bring the remains of the dead down from the mountain. A thorough investigation of the debris field yielded the following conclusions. Damage to the propellers showed that the engines had still been running at full speed at the point of impact. The giant wheels, one of which was still inflated, had remained retracted into the undercarriage, and the debris was spread over a relatively small area. The clues pointed to only one plausible scenario. The Stardust had flown at speed straight into the side of the mountain. But why? How could such an experienced crew have made such a fatal error, be so far off course? And why had the Stardust not been found all those years ago? After all, Mount Tupungato had been thoroughly searched from the air, and there'd been no sign of any wreckage on the slopes of the mountain. Whilst we will never know for sure exactly what happened, the most plausible and accepted explanation is as follows. The crew of the Stardust, approaching the Andes in heavy cloud cover, would have been navigating by dead reckoning, i.e. using a stopwatch, compass, maps, and estimated airspeed to gauge their likely position. Back then there was obviously no GPS, and in this area there were no radio beacons for accurate position finding. Seeing heavy cloud cover and bad weather over the Andes, Captain Cook would have likely flown the Lancastrian up to her limits of around 24,000 feet, giving himself plenty of room to clear the mountains. Flying at this altitude, he may well have decided to abandon the normal route of crossing the Andes west of Mendoza, where the mountains were somewhat lower, and instead to make a beeline straight for Santiago. In theory, there should be no problem. He was well above even the highest peaks. However, it was this extra height that was to prove fatal. Unbeknownst to Captain Cook and his crew, the Stardust was now flying headlong into the lower areas of the jet stream, a high-altitude band of fast-moving air which would have drastically slowed the speed of the plane relative to the ground. Like a swimmer going against the current, the Stardust was ploughing on at speed into the increased headwind, but in reality, she was barely making any headway at all towards Santiago. Back in the 1940s, few aircraft flew at this altitude, and the existence of the jet stream was not fully understood. It would not have been anything that Captain Cook would have anticipated and adjusted for when making his calculations. By around 5:40 p.m, up above the clouds, relying on compass, watching airspeed and watching the clouds roll by below, Captain Cook would have been completely convinced that he was well past the mountains and he could now safely descend. Radio operator Dennis Harmond was instructed to send the message to Santiago, given an ETA of 5:45 p.m, and the Stardust began to drop through the cloud cover, fully expecting to emerge from the clouds and to see Santiago straight ahead. Instead, without any warning, she ploughed straight into the upper south side of Mount Tupungato. The crew and passengers would most likely have died instantly, with no idea of even what had happened to them. It's thought that the impact into the mountainside caused an avalanche of snow from the upper part of the mountain, which then covered the wreck completely. Any search plane flying overhead would have seen nothing. The wreckage of the Stardust lay buried under the snow on the upper reaches of the glacier. Subsequent snowfalls would have served only to bury her further, until eventually the entire wreck would have been submerged into the glacier. Remaining completely hidden, moving slowly down the mountain entombed within the ice, it took 51 years until parts of the wreckage began to emerge, and the fate of the Stardust was finally brought to light. The expedition to the site recovered the remains of at least 4 individuals. Grisly remains included a torso still buried in the ice, a foot with boot still attached, and a perfectly preserved hand of a young woman, manicured nails still there. The expedition team gave an impromptu service for the dead high up on the mountain before the remains were brought back down and returned to Santiago. It's estimated that about 90% of the wreckage still remains within the ice, and it'll become exposed over time as the natural movement of the glacier continues to disgorge artifacts with each passing year. And so the mystery was solved. Well, apart from that final mysterious word transmitted by flight CS-59, STENDEC. If you look around on the internet, you'll find many theories about the meaning of STENDEC, some much more plausible than others. But to this day, no one has been able to provide a single, definitive answer as to why that strange word was transmitted and repeated twice just before the crash. It seems like some mysteries are not meant to be fully explained after all.